Okay, so did you all get the right homework? Hopefully, for a couple of you, I really have no idea how in the world I sent you homework number 3 instead of homework number 4. But anyway, yeah, send me an email while we go through this if I sent you the wrong one. So yeah, this afternoon, the main thing we want to do is go through homework number 4 here. Make sure that we understand things. Once again, I'm going to try to move through this fairly quickly because, obviously, if we go through this in great detail, it's going to take us, more than an hour, and we want to save some time to talk about the exam at the end. So I'll go through this, fairly quickly, and then we'll, if you have questions or, things that need to be discussed in a little bit more detail, please let me know. All right. So the 10 questions of homework number 1. Question number 1. Right, this question has to do with the productivity slowdown. And so when I see productivity slowdown, what's the most direct link in productivity in this short run model? It's R bar, right? A reduction in R bar. And if you remember from our IS curve, what happens if there's a reduction in R bar? This leads to a reduction in the IS curve. So it seems to me the most obvious answer here, right, is that the fall in the IS curve also reduces R bar. And so that's what should happen. Here's a mistake I noticed for a few of you. The MP curve only shifts when R changes, big R, the real interest rate. It does not shift with the marginal product of capital, okay? Because notice that R bar, well, yeah. So anyway, you really should keep the marginal product of capital constant, and then it's R bar that goes down. So what would you, for part B of this, what would you suggest the central bank do? They should probably reduce the marginal, the MP curve by reducing the real interest rate, right? That's probably the best answer. That would also increase aggregate demand. Okay? Okay, whoa. Are you there? Let's talk about, sorry, something got screwed up. That was weird. Something really weird happened to my computer. Let's try this again. Okay. So everybody okay on question number 1? Okay, question number 2. Suppose that the slope of the Phillips curve goes up. What happens to our Phillips curve? It gets steeper. Right? The Phillips curve gets steeper. So what does that mean? Okay. Well, what that means is that for any change in monetary policy, sorry, my phone's going off. For any change in monetary policy, you're going to get a smaller change in short-run output and a larger change in inflation, right? So any change in monetary policy will have more of an impact on inflation, less of an impact on output. Question number 3. Here's the question about the negative aggregate supply shock. So let's begin here. I'm going to talk about this in terms of, well, let's talk about this first in terms of the Phillips curve, and then we will talk about this in terms of aggregate supply. So what happens with our Phillips curve this negative supply shock, which is an increase in O, right? An increase in O is a negative supply shock, shifts our Phillips curve up here to the left. What should this do? It should drive us up towards higher inflation, or, well, assuming the short run output doesn't change, it should drive us up towards higher inflation, right? What happens to our aggregate supply curve? In terms of aggregate supply, aggregate demand, this negative supply curve is going to shift our aggregate supply curve up in this direction in the first period, okay? So first period, aggregate supply goes up, and then what happens after that is that aggregate supply shifts back over the next few periods until in the long run, while short run output fell, it's going to go back to zero in the long run. Likewise, inflation immediately goes up, but then it's going to go back to our long run target over time, okay? So one problem I occasionally saw for a few of you was that you didn't put the dynamics in. And I do want you to talk about that, right? I think some of you said, well, aggregate supply shifts to the left, and then that was it, right? You got to talk about then what happens over time, both the difference between the short run effect of this and the long run effect of this, okay? So in general, I'm going to consider that to be a complete answer. Is not just what happens in the first period, but then what happens over time as you move back towards the long run. So make sure that you talk about that tomorrow, right? Make sure you talk about that, because I do want to see you talk about those things. Okay, let's see. Did I do these in order? Question 3. Question 4. Oh, I see. I have 2 question 3s. Sorry about that. Let me just pull up. Instead of going through all of this question number 4, sorry, once again, the screen sharing thing looks very weird sometimes. Instead of going through all of these, because I think most of them are pretty straightforward, I'm just going to flash the answers up. And I think most of you had all of these right. Maybe there were 1 or 2 problems. Probably the ones that we had the most problem with was answer B and E. And once again, these have to do with this is similar to question number 1 on your homework, about what happens if there's a change in the marginal product of capital, or what happens if there's a change in R bar. And R bar shifts your IS curve, right? It shifts your IS curve. So if there's an increase in R bar, what that means is that your IS curve moves to the right, right? And if there's a decrease in the R bar, that means your IS curve moves to the left. And so I think that was one confusion about what happens when R bar changes, right? Notice that R bar is in your IS curve. So a shift in R bar is going to be like a shift in the IS curve, okay? The rest of these, I think most of you got this, right? That when A bar goes up, that's an increase in the IS curve. And when A bar goes down, that's a decrease in the IS curve. What should the Fed be doing? They should be leaning against the wind, right? So I think, I don't want to go through all of these unless any of you have specific questions, because I think for the most part, people got these right. Okay. Now, this leads to question number 5. So for those of you who did not get this one right, I tried to put the math in a comment. If you sent me a PDF, I can't stick equations into a PDF. And so, if you have a PDF and you weren't able to get this, I couldn't send you any comments on this. But this is the question that's just like our typical ISLM model, or I'm sorry, ISMP model, except here's one difference. We add taxes. So now consumption is not just a function of output, it's also a function of taxes, and taxes are based on your current income. based on your current income, Y tilde, permanent income, Y bar, and then also X bar, which is essentially, you could think about X bar here as the tax rate, right? The tax rate. So what happens if you work through this? So once again, I'm not going to take the time to work through all this math. I did send it to you all so you can work through it. If I think for some of you who are still kind of figuring out how to figure out some of this algebra. But basically, the difference is right here, right? Where you have this extra term in your consumption function. This extra term gets multiplied by AC, right? That should be AC, all right? Not AT, AC. And so what happens is when you work this down, you get this. So what's the difference between this and some of the other stabilizers that we found? Well, here the stabilizer also depends upon the marginal propensity to consume, because notice taxes impact our model through consumption. So you really get an answer very much like the examples we worked in class or the example that we had on homework number 3, except the difference here is you have AC in here, meaning the marginal propensity to consume impacts the tax rate. This is a stabilizer, right? So this fraction here at the beginning is less than 1. What this means is that our IS curve gets steeper, right? And it also means that aggregate demand gets steeper. And so whenever there's a change in monetary policy, it's going to have a smaller effect on short-run output and a larger impact on inflation. Why is this a stabilizer? Because now what happens when short-run output rises, people have to pay more taxes. And that increase in taxes brings consumption down a little bit and stabilizes short-run output a little bit. Vice versa, what happens when short-run output goes down? Well, when short-run output goes down, people get a tax cut, and that encourages consumption a little bit, all right? So, once again, this is very similar to the problem that was on homework number 3, just a little different, a little different. The fact that I've asked you a question like this on homework number 3 and a question like this on homework number 4, you should all take that as a significant hint as to one kind of question you're going to get on tomorrow's exam, right? I mean, you know I'm going to do this. I'm going to take our ISMP curve and I'm going to make a change to it, right? And then ask you to kind of think through, well, what happens, right? What happens? Does this change? How does this change the model? And very importantly, what's the intuition, right? A couple of you actually really screwed up the math, but you kind of used your intuition to tell me what you think should have happened, right? Or what you think you should have found. And that was good. I can't give you full credit, but I can give you a lot of partial credit if you can use your intuition and tell me what you think you should find. And so I really encourage you to think about that tomorrow on the exam, right? If you get the math wrong, or you think you get the math wrong, try to use your intuition, right? A couple of you also said, this is what I got, this doesn't make any sense to me. And you were right, it didn't make any sense, and that was good, right? So those are the kind of things that can get you a lot of partial credit. And you know, I think what a few of you learned from the first exam is, you know, the worst thing you can do is get a lot of zeros on these questions. Even if you can get some partial credit on some of these harder questions and then do well on the easier questions, you can still get a good grade on this exam, right? And I think that's a strategy that a lot of you who did pretty well in the first exam employed, right? So make sure you can get some partial credit, and using your intuition is a good way to do that. Okay, questions number 6 or 7. This one was a little bit harder. So here, I'm actually asking you to do algebraically what we did in class, where you have an aggregate demand shock that lasts for 2 periods, then figure out what happens to output, and then figure out what happens to inflation. Now, what do you have here? You essentially have an aggregate, you have an aggregate demand equation, and you have an aggregate supply equation, okay? And you have 2 unknowns, short-run output and inflation. So this is essentially an algebra problem. 2 equations, 2 unknowns. Solve it, right? Solve it. The big thing that changes, though, is in the first 2 periods, you have to use an A-bar of -2%. So once again, I tried to send you all the math here so that you can look through this yourself and figure out what you did wrong. But how I did this is first I begin with the aggregate supply equation, right? So this first equation here is aggregate supply, where I plug in the numbers, but notice here I don't know what Y1 is, right? And then here's my aggregate demand equation. The second equation is aggregate demand. So you plug in aggregate demand into aggregate supply to eliminate short-run output. And you solve down here doing some math, and you should find that short-run output is -1.78. Then plug this back into either the demand or supply equation to get inflation of 1.11. What happens in the second period? In the second period, you have the same 2 equations, right? The one thing that's changed, though, is now you're solving for short-run output in period 2, and you're solving for inflation in period 2. But the most important thing to remember is, remember what's inflation from period 1, you just calculated it up here. It's 1.11%. So you plug 1.11% in here for inflation in period 1. You have 2 equations and 2 unknowns. You solve them, and what do you get? You get short-run output of -1.42 and inflation of 0.4%. When you do a problem like this, you got to ask yourself, does this make sense, right? Does this make sense? And the best way to check your intuition, right, is is to draw a graph, right? That is the best way to check your intuition. So what happens here in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph? And I did notice that a few of you not only had the problem with the math, but you had a little bit of problem with some of these graphs. And so let's talk about this, right? So here we are at the beginning, and we know that this target is 2%, right? We're told that that's the target. We know that we start in short-run output of 0, right? And then what happens? Aggregate demand falls by 2%, but notice output does not fall by 2%. Why? Because inflation adjusts. So in period 1, we should see inflation fall to below 2% and short-run output fall to below 2%. Is that what we found? Yes. We found that output fell to -1.78% and inflation fell to 1.12%. That's where we are in the first period. Where do we go then in the second period? In the second period, remember now aggregate supply begins to catch up, right? Aggregate supply shifts to the right. So where we go in the second period is we move in this direction. What should we see happen to short-run output? It should go up a little bit. And in fact, it does. It goes up to -1.58. But what should happen to inflation? Inflation should still continue to fall, and that's what I calculated, is inflation now falls all the way down to 0.32. No, that's wrong. Sorry. Put the wrong number in there. Did I? Sorry. Well, yeah, well, it depends upon how much you round your answer, right? I found 0.32. If you round a lot, you're probably going to find something that's a little bit different from this. And so there's where we are in the second period. That answer makes sense, right? That answer makes sense. So what happens in question 7? Question 7 says now aggregate demand goes back to where it was. So what happens to short run output? Well, be clear here. Aggregate demand shifts to the right, but it's also true that aggregate supply is still responding to the old shock. So where are we in period 3? We're actually up here. Aggregate supply falls one more time because remember, aggregate supply is always looking to last period. So aggregate supply curve shifts to the right here one more time. At the same time, aggregate demand goes up. What should we find? We should now find that short run output is high and inflation has gone up, right? So we should find that short run output should now be positive and inflation should go back up. So I should have sent you the math for this, but when you calculate what inflation is in period 3 and what output is, you should find that output is 0.37 in period 3 and inflation is 0.51, which makes sense, right? Inflation has gone up, short run output has gone up. And then finally, what happens in period 4? Now aggregate supply is shifting to the left, right? To get us back to short run output. So these graphs just get to be a mess. Wow, that is not even close to being straight, but, right? What should happen in period 4? Short run output should fall closer to 0. And actually inflation should go up a little bit as we move back towards the long run. What do you find? Inflation does go up by a little bit to 0.67. Short run output falls to 0.33. So we are going back in the long run. Okay. This is a time-consuming question, right? To do all this algebra is a time-consuming question. So, you know, if you got a problem like this or something like this, how do you handle it on the exam tomorrow? Well, you know, listen, you can't spend too much time on any one question, right? So it's fine to do the math, but if you feel like you're very slow at working the math, or if you feel like you make a mistake, one of the things I would really suggest is to, you know, once again, it's okay to provide some intuition about what you should find. Even if you can't do all the math, if you can talk about the intuition you should find, you can get partial credit for these. And that's really important, okay? So, you know, I think for some of you, on this, you weren't able to work through all the math, but you did provide effective graphs to explain what you should find, and so that was good. For a couple of you, you struggled not only with the math, but also struggled with getting the graphs together, and that was a challenge, right? That was a challenge. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about questions 6 and 7? Okay, we're getting there. Rose, your dog is so cute. I just keep on looking at your dog.
Thank you.
He's really enjoying my lecture. Actually, I think that dog might be paying more attention than the rest of you, right? He's like really looking at the screen. He loves me.
Yeah, she's really interested in macroeconomics, obviously.
Oh, obviously. What's her name?
Her name is Haku.
Haku. Very nice. It should be Canes. If she loves the macro that much. All right, here's question number 8. So this is a question that relates to an inflation target. We expressed our inflation target in terms of real interest rates. What's the inflation target look like in terms of nominal interest rates? Well, this one's kind of so simple that I don't think a lot of you could see it. What's the difference between a real interest rate and a nominal interest rate? It's just inflation, right? So how do you turn this into a real interest rate sorry. Right? I'm sorry, I'm going to mess this up. So how do I turn this into a real interest rate? Well, I just note that nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus expected inflation. What's the real interest rate? It's this, right? Rewriting this. And so I can rewrite this like this. Or another way I could rewrite this I could rewrite it like this. So if inflation goes up by 1%, how much should nominal interest rates go up? 1 plus m%. So in other words, if you think about this, hopefully the intuition of this makes a lot of sense. If inflation goes up by 1%, you don't want to just raise nominal interest rates by 1%. You need to raise nominal interest rates by more than that so that the real interest rate changes, right? So you want to raise nominal interest rates by more than the change in inflation so that it changes the real interest rate. So in this case, you have to raise the interest rate by 1 plus m%, right? So if inflation goes up by 1%, you increase the nominal interest rate by 1 plus m%. I think that, yeah, I don't know. I think some of the struggle with it, maybe this was just, like I said, an example of a question that was so easy that we didn't know where to start with, or maybe we didn't know where to start, right? And sometimes that happens, right? You don't know where to start. And so, but anyway, hopefully that now that you see the answer to this, you see that it's a little bit easier than you thought. So then for question number 9, let's use this same interest rate target and put numbers in, okay? So I'm going to use this equation here. What's the real interest rate? 2%. What's M? 0.5. What's inflation? Is negative 1.5%. And once again, the real interest rate is negative 2%. And then finally, what's inflation? Right? No, sorry, this should be negative. You with me? So all I've done is I've just plugged in the numbers into this equation. So I should get 2 plus, what is this? Negative. Wait a second, did I do this wrong? Oh, yes, I did. Sorry, I have a wrong number in here. This should be negative 1.5. So you should get a number, the central bank's targeted nominal interest rate should be negative 1.25%. What does this tell us about the limits of monetary policy? The central bank can't actually set nominal interest rates that low. It's impossible, right? And so this is the limit of having monetary policy based on an interest rate rule is that there's this cutoff, there's this floor, as we've talked about. This is the liquidity trap, that you can't set nominal interest rates negative, and so there's a limit to following these kind of rules. Right? There's a limit to following these kind of rules. Give me 1 second here. Sorry, Logan. I think I sent you the wrong homework. Give me 1 second. Let me send the right one to Logan. No, of course, it's taking forever to load. Well, I will share it, Logan, when when it loads up. All right. Okay, last question. And this is a question that relates to if Japan lowers its inflation target. So what should happen in the long run and what should happen in the short run? So Japan has, or no, I'm sorry, raises inflation target. Apologize. So Japan has this inflation target, but now they want to raise inflation up to here. What should the central bank do? It should cut interest rates, reduce the monetary policy. What does that do? That shifts aggregate demand. But notice, very importantly, and this is probably the main thing I was looking for in this answer, we don't go all the way up to the new target in the first period. We only go partly up in the first period. We don't want to go all the way up because remember, short run output is going to change as a result of this. What then happens in future periods? That aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and where do we end up in the long run? With short run output going back to zero, and in the long run, we get to the new inflation target. So this is what I was, once again, what I'm talking about when I say that that you want to include dynamics, right, in your analysis, right? You want to include dynamics. So I think a lot of you, kind of said, well, aggregate demand will go up, but then but you got to take it a little bit further than that and talk about, well, what happens in the long run, right? What happens in the long run? How eventually does the economy evolve to get us back to zero? All right, so that's question number 4. Did anybody have any homework, anything they want to see again? Any other questions they want to ask? Yeah, Rose.
Yeah, I had a question.
Hold on, Rose asked, and then I didn't.
Sorry, you sent me homework number 3. So
I sent you homework number 3 too.
Yeah.
All right, Rose, hold on. Let me send it again.
If it's easier, you can send it to me after class.
I'll send it to you right now. It's best. So I remember. Yeah, who else had a question? I heard somebody speak. Carson.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
For number 1, I just didn't know what assumptions you were looking for.
Well, I mean, I think that whenever you hear technology and productivity, right, you got to think about the supply side of the model. And in terms of the ISMP, where that supply side really fits in is the marginal product of capital. So, yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to tell you, explicitly. I wanted you to kind of think through this yourself a little bit. But whenever you hear technology, productivity, you got to think about the supply side of the model, and in the ISMP part of our model, that's really with R bar, little r bar.
So you just wanted to see like our process of solving that problem.
Right, but I think it's pretty clear, as I talked about here. I'll just show you this graph again. That when little r bar goes down, that actually shifts our IS curve to the left, okay? And so that moves us towards short run output. I'm sorry, a negative short run output. And then what should be the response? Well, the policymaker response, I didn't put this in here, should be the increased marginal product or the MP curve to get short run output back to where it was. Right, I'm sorry, did I say that wrong? Gosh, it's been a long day. I did say that wrong. That the central bank wants to reduce the MP curve, and that's going to drive short run output back to zero.
Cool. Yeah, I got the R bar and the MP right. I just didn't know what assumptions that you were looking for me to specify there.
Okay. Who else has got a question or two? Do you have any questions about the exam overall? So once again, the exam is going to be on chapters 8 through 14. It will be very similar in format to before. There's going to be kind of 4 big questions, each worth 25 points. But each of these 4 big questions are going to have subparts. Try as I can, I'm going to try to, once again, roughly match up the time we spend on topics to the points on the exam. That's not perfect, but I'm going to try to, have questions about all of the chapters that we talked about in class, right? So I'm going to try to cover all the material, right, within reason. And so, so that's definitely one of the objectives. I don't think the exam should be any longer. In some ways, I think this exam is a little bit, I don't want to get your hopes up and say it's easier. I think one thing about this exam is it's pretty easy. It's a little bit easier to focus on what you have to know for this exam, because so much of this exam is about the short run macro model, right? So, as opposed to the first exam where we talked about the simple production model and the Romer model and the Solow model, and we talked about the labor market where we had kind of a variety of different topics in there. Here, our focus has been much more on short run macro, right? Basically business cycles and stabilization policy. So I'm hopeful that that's helpful. Now, having said that, the short run macro model can be complicated, right? And so, but my hope is that by spending so much time on the short run macro model, after having these 2 homeworks this week, that you're beginning to feel a little bit more comfortable. And so hopefully that will show up in the exam. If I can give you a couple of pieces of advice, one of the pieces of advice I've been giving you here a lot today is, don't spend too much time on any one problem. If you get stuck on something, try to provide some intuition, but don't just sit and stew over the math or stew over, it's some technical part of the problem, right? Because I do think that got a few of you in trouble last time, where you spent way too much on some questions, and as a result, didn't answer questions or did not provide any intuition, any intuitive answers, which can be very good for giving you partial credit. So, space your time. You have 3 hours, 4 big questions or 4 big parts. So don't spend more than 45 minutes on any one, at least to begin with, right? If you have time at the end, go back. But, try to be a little bit better at allocating your time, which I think got a few of you in trouble. The other thing that I will encourage you to do is think in terms of the model, right? So, if you read something and it's not clear, sometimes I think that can be because you're trying to figure out what you think the best answer is. But that's not exactly what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to use the model to determine an answer, okay? And so you got to think, like, for instance, question number 1, right? What in the ISMP model needs to change here, right? Given the question, what exactly is the change that's happening in the ISMP model? So not to use too much of your own thinking, but try to to restrain yourself into thinking in terms of the model. And that's hard, right? It's hard, and it takes practice. But I can't encourage you enough is that to not try to veer off into the speculative or I think this is what would happen in the real world. And I'm not asking you what's happened in the real world. I'm asking you what's going to happen in the model, right? And hopefully they match up, but they may not. So try to discipline yourself that way. Other than that, I think the best advice I can give you for the exam tomorrow is just to read the questions and think a little bit before you start writing, right? And that's for any exam you take in college. That's probably good advice, to actually read and think before you write, which sounds so simple, and yet, it's so hard. So I was just talking with my 6 and 8 year old about this last night. Both of them did do so well on tests this week, and after our long conversation, we figured out is because nobody read any questions. So these are lifelong learning things, right? To slow down and read and think before you write. It's so hard. Okay, any other questions? If not, I'm just going to let you go. You can use this time to study or whatever.
Did you decide if we could go till 12:15 for the photos?
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, so you can go to 12:15. So I will send you the exam number 1 on email. Hopefully I can figure out how to send you the right exam. I'll send you exam number 2 on email. And you'll have between 9 a.m. and 12:15 to complete it, okay? Send it back to me. I do have an errand to run tomorrow. I got to take somebody for a doctor's appointment, but I will try to be checking my phone very regularly. So if a question occurs, send me an email. There might be a little delay, but I'll be checking email and checking in, make sure everything is going okay, all right? Okay, right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Hey, I had one last thing to ask.
Sure.
Probably after class, though. Do you have my homework?
Yes, I do.
Cool. I just wanted to ask a question about number 4, B&E, real quick.
Mm-hmm. Hold on, it's loading here.
Yeah, so you said that it was an increase in R bar, and I did have that for B&E, so I'm just confused why.
Yeah. I mean, quite honestly, Rashid, I graded these. I had to move very quickly, so it would not surprise me if I made some small mistakes here and there.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it looks like you did that right.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. I took off. What did I take off?
Just 0.25.
Okay, yeah, I'll give that back to you. Sorry.
Oh, it's all good.
Yeah, I figured mistakes are probably going to happen at some point, but yeah, sounds good. All right, I'll take care of.
All right. Thank you.
All right, have a good time.
See ya.